This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 17 of season 3 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, April 23rd, 1910. I'll elaborate on what was happening that week. The April 23rd issue begins with the Grange, the Westford Grange. There was a large attendance and much interest at the second meeting of the Grange for April last Thursday evening. There was a delegation of 20 visiting patrons from Chelmsford and 15 from Littleton, as well as representatives from other neighboring Granges. The work of the evening was the conferring of the third and fourth degrees on the class of candidates who received the lower degrees at the previous meeting. The third degree was conferred by the ladies' degree staff under the direction of past master W.M. Wright. Mr. Wright has taken much interest and a justifiable pride in making this staff compare favorably in its work with any surrounding Granges, and the work Thursday evening was a credit to his faithful drilling. The ritualistic and floor work was done with spirit and accuracy. Mrs. Boynton was so capably who so capably presides at the piano, helps very much toward the good results, as well as the good singers in the Grange who aid in the chorus work. After the exercises upstairs, adjournment was made to the lower hall and ice cream, cake, and coffee, and that was attractive in quality and quantity. In charge of caterer Fred A. Smith and a corps of assistants. Owing to the fact that the hall will be unavailable on account of repairs, there will be no meeting in May, and the observation of Children's Night and the 15th anniversary will be held in June, full notice of which will appear later. Deputy Walter A. Morris was present at this session for the annual inspection and reported his duties most favorably. The next section is the Westford Center section. Patriots' Day was quietly observed in our village. Some went to Concord and to Lexington to more stirring scenes. Flags were in evidence through the village. The Liberty was closed for the day. At night, the library was closed for the day. At night, a large delegation went to Littleton to the sunset party. John S. Grieg drove a well-filled barge, and others went in their own teams. A good time was reported. Mr. G.W. Tarleton and little son Grafton W., formerly of Elmhurst, New York, but who are moving to Indiana, are visiting at the Congregational Parsonage. Mrs. Tarleton and Mrs. Wallace are sisters. Mrs. E. W. Jakes and daughter Dorothy have been spending a week with Mrs. Jakes' parents, Mr. and Mrs. William Sutherland. Mr. and Mrs. W. M. Wright met with the most unpleasant experience a week ago last Tuesday evening. While returning from a Grange meeting at Acton Center, they collided with an automobile. They were both thrown out, and the harness and vehicle were badly damaged, but the horse was unhurt. Mr. and Mrs. Wright sustained a severe shaking up and many bruises, and feel that they were fortunate to escape as well as they did. The man with the automobile rendered all possible assistance, as well as some people in a nearby house, and they were able to reach home the same night. The A.J. Abbotts are at home again after a most enjoyable 3 months Mediterranean trip. John Abbott, who was the member of the family who remained at home while his family were away, has himself sailed for a European trip. Mrs. Frank C. Bannister has resigned the carrying of the mails owing to the increased work caused by the new noon mail, which has been in operation for a fortnight. The large and ancient poplar tree, which grew so close to the northeasterly side of the house of W.H. Wright, has been removed. It was much decayed and safer removed, but changes the appearance of that side of the yard and buildings very much. Walter J. Merritt has had ground broken for a new house at the east end of his ground. It is to have all modern improvements, and William Sutherland is in charge of the carpenter work. Reverend David Wallace, Leonard W. Wheeler, and Mrs. Emma Day represented the Congregational Church at the conference at South Acton Wednesday. The next section is the About Town section. Some land, like some folks, has all the calamities that are going. Such is the land owned by J. Willard Fletcher to the eastward of Westford Station that has its annual and semi-annual periodic spells of being burned with fire. This occurred last Saturday on the installment plan. So much burned in the forenoon, then a rest for dinner, then a resumption of more fire, which caused the real run of the day as regards the fire and as regards the run of men folks and folks to it. For a small fire, it caused much smoke, which served as a sort of wireless to the public, hence the run. Fire Warden John A. Healy of Graniteville brought the complement of that village and some fire extinguishers. Constable Edson G. Boynton was all there and helped handcuff the fire. Farmers, tree wardens, and tree climbers for the town came down from their lofty and caused the fire to appear less crofty. That's what it says, but I don't understand it. About 10 acres of mowing land, woodland, and frog land was burned over. The fire was an unintentional incendiary on the part of a spark in the employ of the Boston and Maine Railroad. This was a common type of fire in Westford at this time because the railroad ran right through the town, and they were using steam engines, of course, which generated a lot of smoke and a lot of live ashes or live sparks coming from the smokestack. The Millennium Dawn folks, whoever and wherever they may be, have been holding a strong weekly convention at Marshall's Hall, Westford Corner, commencing last Sunday and continuing onward all day and night. Seems to be the timepiece. The unpronounceable named Italian who opened a variety store on the ground floor of Marshall's Hall has left for the ground floor of some other part of the earth. Whether he could not stand the coming of Millennium Dawn over his head is not known. He left before it appeared. His dealings had the reputation of honesty, but did not have dealings enough for the size of his goods. The H.E. Fletcher Company on Oak Hill, who always keep the tug straight and the holdback loose, are demonstrating it now in the Men That Saw Us. Adding a portable stone saw that runs by electricity and an enormous new stone crusher that does a good deal of its own running after it has got struck a few times with electricity. The stone saw is new to the stone industry and is used chiefly in dressing stone. If it would dress wood for the stone, how relieving when one is so drove. Miss Estella Decatur, eldest of the CRP Decatur Company, that's the name of the family that lived on Lowell Road, left Thursday for California. A stop will be made at Niagara Falls to see how it compares with our home talent, Tadmuck Brook, which is somewhat measured as a crook. As companion to California, she will be accompanied by her uncle, Adam Brunswick Roberts. Clarence R.P. Decatur, while farming on Little Tadmuck Hill, just south of his residence, has discovered a variety of Indian hatchets and other Indian implements of war and peace, including agriculture. If we were to cut wood now with these stone hatchets, how it would dull the wood. But then there would be about as much wood on hand, in some cases, with the stone hatchet as with the modern steel axis. The 19th of April was observed according to temperamental conditions and other environments too numerous to mention. Some became visitors, some played lawn tennis, some played farming, some played fishing without any fish, some played ball. And this last classification was the Westford Academy team, active with youth and use against the Westford alumni, strong, slow, rusty, queer, and misunderstandable. The result, as though nature had gone back on her law of use and disuse for the rust of disuse, won 15-1. The Academy team were smart, active, wonderful catchers, fellows, but like fishing without biting or catching, something is wrong, don't know where. Might as well go home. That is what they do. Next is the Forge Village section. A large number of out-of-town people were occupying their cottages over the holidays. Mr. and Mrs. Clarence Dodge and daughter Viola of Lowell were at their cozy cottage. Mr. and Mrs. Tizer, Tizzer, and family of Melrose are at Sunrise Cottage. Mr. and Mrs. Klobbingsberg of Malden were at Mr. Lothar's camp, Ulika, U-Li-Ka. Mr. and Mrs. George Stewart and daughter Dorothy of Everett will spend this week at their cottage, Tiny Co-Ed, TYNY-CO-ED. The most important event of the week will be the annual fair, which will be held in Recreation Hall Saturday afternoon under the auspices of the Ladies' Sewing Circle, that's of St. Andrew's Mission. All kinds of useful and fancy articles and children's clothes, homemade candies, and many other interesting things will be on sale. While last but not least will be the delicious supper, which will be served at 6 p.m. Dancing will be enjoyed in the evening. A son was born to Mr. and Mrs. William Blodgett of the Ridges, which is actually in Groton on West Prescott Street. On Tuesday, April 19th, he was named George Raymond Blodgett, born on Patriots' Day. A case of measles has made its appearance in the family of Mr. and Mrs. Canton on Bradford Street. Miss May Teller of Reading visited Mrs. Mary L. Drake for a few days this week. Mr. and Mrs. John E. Burnett were entertained over the holiday by Mr. and Mrs. John E. Jones of Worcester. Mr. and Mrs. Henry Catchpole were guests on Patriots' Day of Mr. and Mrs. William Kirk at their home in Worcester. Miss Sarah Precious spent the holiday with her sister, Mrs. Michael Keefe of Townsend Harbor. Miss Emily Catchpole and Miss Eleanor Chagru visited with Mr. and Mrs. Herbert Catchpole the first of the week at their home in Boston. Mrs. George Kugel is recovering from an attack of tonsillitis. Mr. and Mrs. LeSure and family and Mr. and Mrs. Des Laurier and family left Monday for Canada, where they will spend the summer. Mr. and Mrs. Frank Guards, are spelled Gardes, who were married last Sunday in the Church of the Ascension, East Boston, are spending their honeymoon at the Edwards house. They were entertained at lunch Patriots' Day by Mr. and Mrs. James Wilson. Henry Gurney of Lowell and his son Victor, who has just returned from the South, have been spending a few days at the Gurney cottage. Dr. O'Brien and Dr. Walsh of Lowell enjoyed a fishing trip to Forge Pond Tuesday. They returned home with a fine string of pouts, that is, horn pouts or bullheads. Daniel Hanley, for many years boss wool sorter for Abbott and Company, has resigned his position to take effect within a few days. Hugh Daly of Leominster, formerly of this village, has returned and will be in charge of the wool sorting department. Mr. Daly has had wide experience in the sorting room, where he was employed for 36 years. His many friends will be pleased to learn that he has returned. His family will move here when a tenement can be obtained. The next section is called Forest Fire. A fire, which for a time looked serious, was started Sunday afternoon on Finsmere Farm, the property of Mrs. Holbrook, and spread rapidly over the boundary into Groton. The flames found excellent material in the dry leaves and grass, and in a very short time 30 acres of woodland were one mass of flames. The fire continued until within a few feet of the residence of William Ward. The electric cars were held up for a time, and traffic on the road was impossible. Messrs. Sturgis and Hilliard of Groton School, who were to conduct the services at St. Andrew's Mission, were held up by the flames and were obliged to drive through Littleton in order to reach the village. Fire wardens George O. Jackson and J. A. Healy were soon on the scene, and with the assistance of the John Edwards Hose Company and the A. R. Choate Hose Company of Graniteville, soon had the fire under control. It is supposed that the fire was started by sparks from the 210 freight from Ayer to Lowell, and fanned by a high wind, the flame spread from the railroad to the land adjoining. The fire attracted a large number of people. Owing to the direction of the wind, it was thought that the residents of William Ward would fall a prey to the flames. Part of the land burned was the property of Mrs. Holbrook, and several acres are owned by a resident of Groton. And that's the news in Westford for the week ending April 23rd, 1910. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of Westford Cat for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Westford Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.